Tomorrow you could wake up in a world where your father has the legal right to execute you for intimate relationships, where certain behaviors in private could end your career instantly, and where children were trained from birth to serve the whims of emperors. You think you know about Roman culture. You think you know about Roman culture. Here's what they don't teach in history class. The Roman Empire didn't just conquer the world, it built an entire civilization on intimate control, where every bedroom was a battlefield and every private moment could be your death sentence. Welcome to the real Rome. You don't learn this in history classes, but for over 500 years, the Roman Empire operated the most sophisticated system of intimate control in human history. I've scoured through thousands of primary sources, archaeological evidence from Pompeii, and ancient legal documents that most academics avoid discussing. What I've discovered will fundamentally change how you view ancient civilization and make you grateful for every freedom you have today. Here's what most people don't realize. We're about to journey through 7 levels of intimate horror that escalated throughout Roman history, from laws that made certain behaviors punishable by death to women being executed for experiencing pleasure to virgin priestesses buried alive for breaking their vows. Let's start with the most basic rule that governed every Roman's life and death. Imagine if your private behavior determined your public status. Imagine if being perceived as passive in intimate situations meant losing your job, your citizenship, and possibly your life. In Rome, this wasn't imagination. It was law. Being labeled as submissive in private meant social death worse than actual murder. The Romans built an entire civilization on a simple, terrifying principle where dominance equals power and submission equals destruction. You think cancel culture is harsh today? Romans cancelled people for their perceived intimate roles. Literally, one rumor about your private preferences could destroy a political career that took decades to build. The truly disturbing part is that this wasn't some unspoken social rule. Rome codified intimate behaviors into law, creating a hierarchy that determined whether you lived as a respected citizen or died as a social outcast. Let me give you the most famous example, one that nearly changed the course of world history. Julius Caesar, the man who would conquer Gaul and transform Rome into an empire, spent his entire life fighting rumors about what happened when he was 19 years old. During a diplomatic mission to King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, young Caesar allegedly took a submissive role in their private arrangements. Here's what most people don't realize. This single rumor followed him for 40 years. His enemies called him the Queen of Bithynia in the Senate. During his triumph parades, moments meant to celebrate his greatest military victories, soldiers sang mocking songs about Caesar being every woman's man and every man's woman. The poet Catullus wrote verses about Caesar's supposed submission that Romans memorized and repeated at parties. Imagine conquering entire nations, becoming the most powerful man in the world, and still having people mock you for something that allegedly happened in private 4 decades ago. But it gets worse. The Romans didn't just mock, they legislated. The Lex Scantinia, passed in 149 BC, made passive intimate behavior by freeborn males a crime punishable by enormous fines, exile, or even death. The law was so severe that accusations alone could destroy lives. We have documented cases of senators expelled from office not for corruption or incompetence, but for rumors about their private roles. Take the case of a senator whose name was literally erased from records. That's how shameful this was considered. He was expelled from the Senate after slaves reported witnessing him in a submissive position with his wife. Yes, you read that correctly. Certain acts with your own spouse could end your political career. The Romans had a special term for this called impurum, impure mouth. Once labeled with this designation, you were considered permanently contaminated. People wouldn't share meals with you, wouldn't let you kiss their children, wouldn't even speak to you in public. The truly insane part was the mathematical precision of their intimacy hierarchy. At the top sat the emperor. He could dominate anyone and maintain his dignity. Below him, senators could dominate anyone except the emperor and fellow senators. Citizens could dominate freedmen, slaves, and non-citizens. Freedmen could only dominate slaves. Slaves could dominate no one without permission. Breaking this hierarchy wasn't just embarrassing, it was criminal. No. Here's a specific example that shows how seriously Romans took this system. A wealthy citizen named Lucius was caught in a submissive position with his own slave. The legal consequences were devastating. First, he lost his citizenship rights. Then his property was confiscated. His children were disinherited. His wife was forced to divorce him to protect her own status. Finally, he was exiled from Rome forever, all because he took the wrong role with someone he literally owned. Now let's talk about how Rome literally outlawed female enjoyment of intimacy. Imagine if experiencing pleasure during intimate moments was a crime punishable by death. Imagine being forced to lie completely still, showing no emotion, making no sound, while your body's natural responses could get you executed. This wasn't some dystopian fiction. This was daily reality for Roman women. Rome built an entire legal system around a paradox that would break modern minds. They celebrated male desire while making female enjoyment a capital offense. You complain about intimate performance anxiety today. Roman women performed not enjoying themselves to stay alive. The consequences for showing pleasure were catastrophic. A woman who moved too much, made sounds of enjoyment, or showed any sign of pleasure could face accusations of adultery, even with her own husband. The truly disturbing part, her own father had the legal right to execute her for it. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, passed a series of moral reforms in 18 BC that turned female intimacy into a death trap. The Lex Julia de Adulteris Coascendis didn't just punish adultery, it criminalized female agency entirely. Under this law, a father who discovered his daughter had engaged in premarital relations could legally execute both her and her partner on the spot. No trial, no appeal, just execution. Here's what most people don't realize. Augustus used this law to exile his own daughter, Julia the Elder. Despite being the emperor's daughter, despite being married with 5 children, Julia was banished to a remote island for the crime of enjoying intimacy too publicly. Her specific offense was attending parties where she allegedly showed enthusiasm during private encounters. Augustus forbade anyone from visiting her, banned wine from her diet, and declared that she should be buried outside the family tomb. The Emperor of Rome destroyed his own daughter for experiencing pleasure, but it gets worse. Roman medical experts created an entire mythology around female desire, designed to terrorize women into numbness. They claimed that female arousal caused hysteria, insanity, and demonic possession. So, Dr. Soranus of Ephesus, considered Rome's greatest gynecologist, wrote that women who experienced too much pleasure would suffer from wandering uterus, a condition where the womb would detach and float around the body, causing madness. The treatments for female arousal were essentially medical torture. We have detailed records of the procedures. Women showing signs of enjoyment were subjected to cooling treatments, forced to sit in ice water for hours, drink potions made from lead and mercury, or undergo fumigation, where they breathed toxic smoke to calm the womb. Wealthy women paid fortunes for doctors to essentially poison them into numbness. Consider the case of Saronia, a noble woman whose story survives in fragments. After her husband reported that she seemed to enjoy their wedding night excessively, she was sent to Rome's leading medical authorities. The treatment regimen was horrifying. Daily ice baths at dawn, forced consumption of bitter herbs that caused illness, bloodletting to reduce passion, and application of lead powder to cool the body. After 6 months of this medical torture, Saronia had learned to lie perfectly still during intimate encounters. Showing no response whatsoever, the doctors declared her cured. Roman women developed elaborate survival strategies that read like psychological horror. They created secret networks to teach each other the performance of numbness. Older women instructed younger ones in the art of emotional suppression, how to breathe silently, how to keep facial muscles relaxed, how to prevent involuntary responses. We have fragments of letters where mothers write to daughters with advice like, think of household accounts during the act and bite your tongue if you feel pleasure rising. But the most horrifying fate awaited Rome's sacred virgins who dared to experience human touch. Imagine if losing your purity meant being buried alive while the city celebrates. Imagine being selected at age 6 to serve a goddess who demands 30 years of perfect chastity. knowing that one moment of human weakness equals death by suffocation in an underground tomb. You think purity culture is extreme today? Romans turned virginity into a death cult that makes modern religious celibacy look like a casual suggestion. The Vestal virgins were Rome's most powerful women and its most terrified. They controlled the sacred flame that supposedly protected the empire, handled state secrets, and enjoyed privileges no other women possessed. They could own property, make wills, and travel without male guardians. But here's what most people don't realize. They paid for this power with 3 decades of intimate terror, where a single kiss could mean dying alone in the dark. The execution method was specifically designed to be a living nightmare. When a Vestal was condemned for breaking her vow of chastity, Rome didn't just execute her, they buried her alive in an underground chamber called the Campus Celeratus, the evil field. But they couldn't spill a Vestal's blood because she was sacred, so they created a legal fiction that she wasn't being executed at all. She was simply being sent to the goddess. Here's how the burial ritual worked, and the details will haunt you. First, the condemned Vestal was stripped of her sacred garments and dressed like a bride because death was framed as her marriage to the underworld. She was bound with leather straps and placed in a closed litter, so no one could hear her cries as she was carried through the city. The entire population was required to attend in absolute silence. Anyone who spoke or looked away faced punishment. At the burial site, workers had prepared an underground room just large enough for a bed, a lamp with 1 day's worth of oil, and a small amount of bread and water. The truly disturbing part. They included these provisions so they could claim they weren't killing her. They were just putting her in a room where she happened to die. The psychological torture of including just enough supplies to prolong death, but not enough to survive, was intentional. The condemned Vestal was forced to climb down a ladder into the chamber herself. She had to participate in her own burial. Once inside, the ladder was removed, the opening was sealed with earth, and the ground was smoothed over as if nothing was there. She died slowly in the dark, probably taking several days to suffocate or die of thirst. Above ground, the city returned to normal life while she clawed at the earth ceiling until her fingers bled. Let me tell you about Vestal Cornelia, whose execution under Emperor Domitian shows how political these deaths could be. Cornelia had served faithfully for over 20 years when she was suddenly accused of impurity. The evidence? None. Domitian needed a scapegoat for military defeats and decided that the gods must be angry about impure Vestals. Cornelia protested her innocence even as they dressed her in burial clothes. Witnesses reported that she cried out, "How can Caesar call me impure when he has conquered and triumphed during my service?" It didn't matter. She was buried alive to satisfy imperial paranoia. The surveillance network around Vestals was staggering. They were followed by guards, watched by slaves, monitored by priests. Every word, gesture, and glance was reported and analyzed. They couldn't speak to men without witnesses. They couldn't leave their house without escorts. They couldn't even smile at male relatives without risking accusation. We have records of Vestals being investigated for laughing too loudly at dinner parties. But if sacred virgins faced death, imagine what happened in the emperor's bedroom. Now we enter the nightmare realm of imperial bedrooms where human children became living servants. Imagine if world leaders could legally turn your children into personal servants. Imagine if the most powerful man on earth collected infants to train as attendants, hosted inappropriate dinners as state entertainment, and married castrated boys in public ceremonies. You think powerful men abuse their positions today? Roman emperors made modern scandals look like amateur hour because they didn't hide their perversions. They made them state policy. The Roman Empire granted its emperors absolute immunity from normal social rules. Whatever sick fantasy crossed an imperial mind became reality, enforced by legions and funded by taxes. The progression from power to perversion was predictable and horrifying. Each emperor tried to outdo his predecessors in extremism, creating a competitive spiral of depravity that destroyed countless lives. Let's start with Emperor Tiberius, who retired to the island of Capri and turned it into a training facility that defies modern comprehension. Ancient historian Suetonius, who had access to imperial archives, recorded details that most modern academics refused to translate fully. Tiberius created what he called his little fish, children trained from infancy to perform aquatic services. Here's what most people don't realize about the systematic nature of this horror. Tiberius had pools constructed specifically for these activities. Children as young as toddlers were trained to swim between his legs and perform services while he floated. He called them his minnows. The training began before they could speak, conditioning infants to associate water with servitude. Those who cried or resisted were drowned in the same pools. But it gets worse. Tiberius collected what he called tight rosebuds, young boys at the specific age where their bodies were just beginning to develop. He had procurement agents across the empire whose sole job was identifying and kidnapping children at this exact developmental stage. Parents who resisted had their entire families crucified. The lucky children died quickly. The unlucky ones aged out and were discarded like broken toys. Then came Caligula, who made his uncle Tiberius look restrained. Caligula didn't just commit inappropriate acts with family members, he turned it into performance art. He engaged inappropriately with all three of his sisters publicly at state banquets while forcing senators to watch and applaud and applaud. When his favorite sister Drusilla died, he declared her a goddess and made worship of her mandatory. The truly insane part was the religious doctrine Caligula created around imperial behavior. He claimed that as a living god, normal human taboos didn't apply to him. He compared himself to Jupiter, who married his sister Juno. Anyone who questioned the divinity of his inappropriate relationships faced execution for atheism. Imagine being forced to worship the abuse you witnessed or die for impiety. But even Caligula's depravity pales before Nero, who achieved new levels of horror through theatrical innovation. Nero castrated a boy named Sporus because he resembled Nero's dead wife. He then married Sporus in public ceremony, complete with bridal veil and dowry, forcing the mutilated child to play the role of empress. Roman citizens were required to celebrate this wedding or face treason charges. Nero's other innovations included what he called beast games. So he would have himself released from a cage dressed in animal skins, then attack the private parts of men and women tied to stakes. This wasn't private perversion. It was public entertainment at the arena. Thousands watched their emperor simulate being a wild animal, assaulting bound victims. The crowd was required to cheer or face accusations of disloyalty. You think modern society is obsessed with performance? Romans turned intimacy into a competitive sport. Imagine if intimate marathons were broadcast like the Olympics. Imagine if your city gave civic honors for endurance performance. If wealthy matrons publicly competed with professionals in intimate contests. If gladiators earned freedom through physical athletics instead of combat. You binge Netflix today? Romans binged human performances with the same casual entertainment value, except their shows featured real people destroying themselves for applause. Rome didn't just normalize public intimacy, it gamified it. They created formal competitions with rules, judges, and scoring systems. Winners received prizes, fame, and social advancement. Losers faced humiliation, slavery, or death. The most legendary intimate competition in Roman history involved Empress Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. According to Pliny the Elder, who recorded it as historical fact, Messalina challenged Rome's most famous courtesan Sylla to an endurance contest. The rules were simple. Whoever could service more clients in a single night won. Here's what most people don't realize about the systematic nature of this competition. They held it in an establishment in the Subura, Rome's entertainment district. Official judges tracked each encounter. Slaves kept hydration stations stocked. Doctors stood by to examine contestants for injuries. The competition began at sunset with crowds gathering to place bets. Sylla, the professional, paced herself efficiently. She had techniques developed over years, positions that minimized exhaustion, recovery methods between partners, mental dissociation, strategies. By dawn, she had serviced 23 clients and declared herself finished, exhausted but satisfied with what she assumed was victory. But Messalina was just getting started. The Empress, driven by imperial competitiveness and possible stimulant drugs, continued taking clients even after Sylla conceded. She reached 25 clients and kept going. Historical accounts say she only stopped when Claudius's freedmen forcibly removed her, still unsatisfied and demanding more competitors. She had won, but victory wasn't enough. She wanted to establish a record no one could break. No one could break. But the truly insane part, Romans employed human beings as living intimate education manuals. Imagine if intimate education meant watching live demonstrations by professionals. Imagine attending your wedding rehearsal, where trained experts showed you exactly how to perform on your wedding night. Not with diagrams or dolls, but with their own bodies in real time. You learned about intimacy from books or videos. Romans learned from live human performances that would be illegal in every country today. The Spintrii were Rome's professional intimate demonstrators, and their existence reveals depths of systematic perversion that historians still struggle to explain. These weren't courtesans or entertainers, they were academic specialists who turned their bodies into educational tools. The Romans approached intimate education with the same systematic methodology they applied to engineering aqueducts or training legions. The selection process for Spintrii began in childhood, and the criteria were specific to the point of insanity. Scouts searched for children with particular physical attributes, extreme flexibility, unusual stamina, specific body proportions that allowed for exotic positions. They looked for double-jointed limbs, abnormal muscle control, and high pain tolerance. These children were purchased or taken from families and began training before puberty. Here's what most people don't realize about Spintrii training academies. They operated like athletic schools with dormitories, training schedules, and graduated curriculum. Young Spintrii spent years learning to contort their bodies into positions that would hospitalize normal humans. They practiced specific breathing techniques to maintain positions that cut off air supply. They developed muscle memory for sequences that defied anatomical logic. The mortality rate during training was staggering. We have partial records from one academy showing that fewer than half of trainees survived to graduation. Deaths came from internal injuries, broken bones that pierced organs, and infections from repeated tissue damage. Wedding night instruction was their most common booking. Roman brides, especially young ones from noble families, were expected to be pure, but also somehow skilled in techniques that pleased their husbands. The solution? Live demonstration. The night before the wedding, the bride would watch Spintrii perform every position and technique her new husband might demand, with detailed explanations of how to breathe, where to place weight, and how to avoid injury. The psychological trauma inflicted on these brides was devastating. Imagine being a 14-year-old girl raised in relative shelter, suddenly forced to watch adults perform acts that violated every natural instinct while knowing you'd be expected to replicate them tomorrow. Many brides became violently ill during demonstrations. Some fainted. The Spintrii were trained to continue performing regardless of audience reactions. All of this insanity was literally carved into their streets. And if you walked through any Roman city, you couldn't escape the stone symbols pointing the way. Imagine if every street sign was shaped like reproductive organs. Imagine if your children played hopscotch around giant stone symbols. If your garden statues were massive phallic monuments. If military victories were commemorated with genital monuments. You think Times Square is explicit today? Roman cities were basically open-air reproductive museums where every corner displayed intimate organs as casually as we display stop signs. The archaeological evidence from Pompeii alone reveals the staggering extent of public phallic display. Over 40 stone symbols are carved into street corners, and that's just what survived the volcanic eruption. These weren't hidden in alleys, they were on main thoroughfares at child height, worn smooth by thousands of hands, touching them for luck. But here's what most people don't realize: these phallic carvings served as navigation. The stone symbols literally pointed the way to entertainment districts. Size indicated quality. The larger the carved symbol, the more expensive the establishment. Multiple symbols in a row created a trail like reproductive breadcrumbs leading customers through the city. Some had additional elements that indicated special services. Every Roman home, from slave quarters to senatorial villas, displayed protective phalluses. The god Priapus, depicted as a grotesquely endowed man threatening thieves with his massive member, stood guard in gardens. These weren't subtle symbols. We're talking 6-foot statues with prominent features painted bright red. Children played around them. Families picnicked in their shadow. The normalization was complete. Here's a specific example from Pompeii that shows how integrated these symbols were into daily life. At a bakery on Via della Bandanza, archaeologists found ovens with phallic-shaped molds for making bread. Above the ovens, a massive stone symbol protected the baking process. The bakery sign, a carved relief showing Priapus weighing his enormous member against a bag of gold. Customers bought symbolically shaped bread under a phallic sign from ovens protected by reproductive carvings. It was symbols all the way down. So, what does all this insanity tell us about human nature? Remember when I said every private moment could be your death sentence? Now you understand. I wasn't exaggerating. We've just travelled through 7 circles of Roman intimate hell, each more disturbing than the last. From laws that made certain positions punishable by death to emperors who turned children into living servants, from women buried alive for experiencing pleasure to competitions where people literally died for intimate records. Here's what ties all these horrors together. Rome didn't just have extreme intimate practices, it built an entire civilization on intimate terror, the hierarchy of dominance that destroyed careers. Criminalization of female pleasure that killed daughters. The virgin death cult that suffocated priestesses. The imperial corruption that industrialized abuse. The intimate competitions that gamified assault. The human demonstration manuals that broke bodies for education. The phallic monuments that made obscenity sacred. All of it was part of a systematic use of intimacy as a weapon of social control. The Roman Empire conquered the world through military might, but it controlled its own citizens through intimate legislation. Every bedroom became a battlefield where the wrong position meant social death. Every marriage bed became a courtroom where female pleasure was criminal evidence. Every virgin became a potential sacrifice to state security. Every child became potential imperial property. Every competition became a death match. Every demonstration became a torture session. Every street corner became a reproductive shrine. But here's the ultimate revelation. Rome fell not despite, but because of intimate extremism. The same perversions that demonstrated imperial power also destroyed imperial humanity. Emperors who saw citizens as toys couldn't inspire loyalty. Senators who feared bedroom accusations couldn't govern effectively. Women trained to feel nothing couldn't raise healthy children. Men obsessed with dominance couldn't form stable partnerships. A civilization that turned intimacy into violence eventually tore itself apart. What Roman intimate history reveals about power and control should terrify us. When governments legislate what happens in bedrooms, when powerful men face no consequences for their appetites, when intimacy becomes performance rather than connection, when children are exposed to adult content as normal, when competition replaces intimacy, when bodies become demonstration tools. When obscenity becomes sacred, civilization doesn't become more sophisticated, it becomes more savage. Next time you complain about dating apps, remember Roman women faking numbness to survive state-mandated marital relations. Your worst dating experience beats being buried alive for experiencing pleasure. Modern intimate freedom, the right to choose partners, positions, and pleasure, is a historical anomaly we take for granted. For most of human history, what happened in bedrooms was controlled by law, religion, and social terror. We live in paradise compared to Roman intimate terror. You can choose your partners without checking their legal status. You can experience pleasure without fearing execution. You can refuse advances without being murdered by your father. You can love whoever you want without being buried alive. You can compete intimately for fun rather than survival. You can learn about intimacy from books rather than broken human demonstrators. You can walk down streets without navigating by stone reproductive symbols. But here's why understanding this matters for modern society. The Roman impulses haven't disappeared. They've just gone underground. Every politician who legislates bedrooms channels Roman control. Every powerful person who abuses their position echoes imperial perversion. Every culture that shames female pleasure continues Roman misogyny. Every society that makes intimacy performance rather than connection follows Roman footsteps toward destruction. The Roman Empire shows us what happens when intimacy becomes a weapon. When private acts become performance, when power faces no boundaries, when law enters bedrooms, when children become objects, when competition replaces connection, when bodies become tools, when obscenity becomes normal, it's a warning written in stone symbols and buried virgins. Sunburns. Civilizations that weaponize intimacy destroy themselves from within. We have a choice. We can learn from Rome's catastrophic experiment in intimate control, or we can repeat their mistakes with modern variations. We can protect intimate freedom as a human right, or watch it erode through legislation and shame. We can treat intimacy as sacred personal connection, or reduce it to public performance and competition. We can protect children from adult content, or normalize their exploitation. We can see the warning signs or ignore them until we're burying our own innocence. Subscribe for more disturbing historical truths they don't teach in school. Comment which Roman intimate horror shocked you most. Share this before it gets buried, like a Vestal virgin who dared to feel human. Because those who don't learn from history aren't just doomed to repeat it, they're doomed to repeat it in their bedrooms, their laws, and their children's lives. The Roman Empire conquered the world and then destroyed itself through intimate extremism. The question is, will we learn from their screams or add our own to history's chorus of intimate terror? The choice is ours. Choose wisely. Your civilization depends on it.